On the evening of February 20th, 2013, 49-year-old coach Jimmy McLean blew his whistle and brought basketball practice to an end inside of a high school gym in Memphis, Tennessee. His young players rushed to the sidelines and gathered up around Jimmy. And even amongst a group of basketball players, Jimmy looked big. He was 6'4", but his long arms and legs made him seem even taller. And even though he was almost 50 years old, he still completely looked like he could get out on that court and play. Jimmy told the kids they had a great practice, and he told them what he wanted them to focus on over the next few days. Jimmy and the other coaches had led the team to a great season, but they all had their eyes on a state championship, and Jimmy knew how much hard work and focus it would take to get there. Jimmy had been an incredible high school basketball player in his own right back in Arkansas where he grew up. He'd gone on to play at the University of Central Arkansas alongside Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen, and after college, Jimmy actually played ball in a professional minor league for years. And so now, the young men on his team looked up to Jimmy because of his illustrious basketball career, but also they admired him because he was one of their teachers and mentors, and they knew he cared about them as people first and as players second. Jimmy just wanted them to do their best and take care of each other, win or lose. Jimmy told the team to go hit the showers and then go home and hit the books. He had a quick talk with the other coaches and then headed out to his car in the school parking lot. The drive home took Jimmy about 30 minutes away to Cordova, a suburb that was made up of secluded neighborhoods filled with huge homes that had perfectly manicured lawns. Jimmy had lived here in Cordova for about 15 years, but there were still times it felt like a different world from the small Arkansas town he'd grown up in. But as he got older, Jimmy had really come to embrace Cordova as his home, and he knew living there had allowed him to pursue his passions. Jimmy loved basketball, but sports was not all that he cared about. He was also a very talented writer, and he was a devout Christian who felt a calling to serve God and his community. And so during his time in Cordova, Jimmy had written his first book and become a pastor at a local church, two dreams he'd had since he was a kid. A little after 8:30 p.m., Jimmy pulled onto a street, which looked like most of the other streets in town. He drove past the driveway of his large 4-bedroom house, parked by the curb, and then hit the button on his garage door opener. Jimmy took a deep breath and watched as the garage door opened. In public places like church or school, Jimmy was outgoing, energetic, and confident. But there was a different side to Jimmy, a side that only the people closest to him ever saw. In private, Jimmy often got really anxious, and some people even said obsessive, about the littlest of things. Once the garage door was all the way open, Jimmy swung his car around and backed down the driveway all the way into the garage, with his car facing out onto the street. Then once he was parked inside, he pushed the garage door button again, and he sat in his car watching the garage door close. This order of how he would go about parking his car was something he did every single time he came home, and he never changed the routine. He would always sit there in the car watching the door until it came all the way closed. Once the door was closed, Jimmy grabbed his leather bag out of the passenger seat, got out of his car, unlocked the door that led from the garage into the house, and he walked inside. Once he was inside, he locked the door he had just come through and went right to the front room of the house. There, he carefully laid his bag down on a leather couch and then very carefully placed his keys on top of the bag, just like he did every single night when he got home from practice. After all that, Jimmy walked over to the leather couch that matched the chair that he had just put his bag and keys on, and he took off his sport coat, folded it along the sleeves, and laid it over the arm of this couch. And then once that ritual was complete, he went towards the front door, leaned down, and then slid a small rug that was in the entryway up against the bottom of the door. He would say he did this to keep the draft out. Jimmy never missed any of these steps when he got home, and he would go through them again in reverse order when leaving for work in the morning. People who loved Jimmy usually just got used to his particular habits, but they also knew Jimmy had a lot of trouble adjusting to how other people did things. And also, Jimmy really did not like to be confronted about his routines. Jimmy's phone buzzed inside of his pocket, and he smiled. Right on time, he thought. He grabbed his phone, and he read a text message from his girlfriend, Carlotta Smith. Her message said, "How was practice?" And Jimmy replied, "Great!" Carlotta lived almost 3 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, so Jimmy only saw her maybe a few times a month. But they made sure to text or call each other every morning and every night. And Carlotta always seemed to know exactly when Jimmy got home from school. Now, the long-distance aspect of their relationship could get frustrating, but Jimmy couldn't remember the last time he was this happy. Jimmy was technically still married, but he and his wife had separated 4 years earlier, and they had finally started divorce proceedings. But Jimmy had been slow to get into another serious relationship. Part of him still felt loyal to his soon-to-be ex-wife and her 2 kids, who he was a stepfather to. But when Jimmy had met Carlotta 6 months earlier, he knew almost right away that he was falling in love all over again. Jimmy slipped his phone back into his pocket, and he walked through the room past the fireplace and towards the kitchen, but he suddenly stopped. He thought he heard something. Jimmy stood there for a second, and then he heard the sound again. It was coming from somewhere out front of the house. He turned around and walked towards one of the windows that overlooked the front yard, but there was nothing out there, and it was totally silent. And so Jimmy figured, he was just being anxious, like there's nothing going on here. So he left the window and headed back towards the kitchen, but then he heard another sound right behind him, and this time he knew something was right outside his front door. At 8:40 p.m. that night, so just a few minutes after Jimmy had gotten home, his next-door neighbor was home and having a bite to eat at the dining room table when he suddenly heard popping sounds. Now, the sounds were loud enough that the neighbor immediately stopped eating, got up, went to the window to look outside, but they didn't see anything and they didn't hear anything. Now, the neighbor knew the sounds he had heard could have been gunfire, but it also could have just been some kids setting off firecrackers, like he really didn't know. But just in case, he grabbed his phone off the table and he called the non-emergency number for the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. And when they picked up, he explained to the operator that he just heard these loud sounds right nearby that he thought maybe could be gunfire. The operator told him to stay in his house and that an officer would be over right away. And sure enough, a few minutes later, a Shelby County deputy knocked on the neighbor's door, and Jimmy's neighbor told him what he had told the operator. The deputy thanked him and said he'd take a look around and see if he could find anything, and then he left the neighbor's house and headed back towards his cruiser. The deputy drove around the small neighborhood several times and did what he thought was a thorough patrol of the area. But he didn't find anything suspicious, so finally he went back to Jimmy's neighbor and told him, everything seemed fine. Then the deputy left and drove back to the station, and Jimmy's neighbor tried to calm his nerves and not worry too much about the strange sounds. Two days later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2013, one of Jimmy's fellow basketball coaches sat in the high school's front office across from a school administrator, and both men looked very worried. Jimmy had not shown up to teach his classes or to coach basketball practice the previous day, which was completely out of the ordinary. Jimmy almost never missed school or practice. He would rather show up sick than feel like he was letting the kids down. And he definitely wouldn't stay home without calling to let somebody know he was not going to come in. Now, the day before, when Jimmy hadn't shown up, both of these men had told themselves that, maybe there had been some sort of miscommunication, that, perhaps Jimmy had let somebody in the office know he wasn't coming in, but that didn't get relayed. But now, Jimmy was gone for a second day in a row, and nobody at the school had any record of him calling. And now the coach and the administrator really regretted not doing something 24 hours earlier. So the administrator dialed the Shelby County Sheriff's Department, and he said his colleague, Jimmy McLean, had not come into work for 2 straight days, and that was really strange, and he wondered if maybe police could go by Jimmy's house to make sure he was okay. The operator got Jimmy's address and told the administrator that an officer would go to Jimmy's property to do a wellness check right away. A little bit later that morning, at about 10 a.m., 2 Shelby County deputies arrived at Jimmy's house. They went up to the front door and they knocked, but they got no response. And after a little while of just total silence, one of the deputies tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. So he called his boss and got permission to try to force his way into Jimmy's house. The deputy used a simple lockpicking tool to quickly get the door open, and then once it was, he and his colleague stepped inside, and immediately they called their boss back. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Jason Valentine of the Shelby County Sheriff's Department parked in front of Jimmy's house and approached the 2 deputies, who were now standing just outside of the open front door. Lieutenant Valentine put on his gloves and greeted the 2 deputies, and then they stepped aside to let him pass. Once inside, Valentine made his way to the front room of the house, and right away he noticed a large dried blood stain on the other side of the room in front of the fireplace. And just beyond the blood, Valentine saw the dead body of a middle-aged man. Valentine walked over to the body and saw that the man's face, neck, and shirt were also stained with large amounts of dried blood, and the man's limbs looked very stiff, like rigor mortis had set in. And so this, coupled with all the dried blood, made Valentine think that the man had been dead for a while. Valentine began to scan the room. He saw in a nearby leather chair there was a bag with keys sitting on top of it, and then on the couch there was a sports coat laying over the arm. Valentine went to the coat, reached into the inside pocket, and he found a wallet with a driver's license inside of it. And the man in the photo matched the man on the floor. It was Jimmy McLean, and from the looks of it, Jimmy had been murdered. And so at this point, Lieutenant Valentine asked the two deputies outside to come into the house and help him do an initial search. And right away, they noticed there was a whole bunch of high-end electronics that were left untouched all throughout the house. And so this seemed to indicate to the officers that, it didn't seem likely that the person who killed Jimmy had come here to rob him. It seemed like they had come here to kill him. After searching the 4 bedrooms, which all seemed undisturbed, Valentine walked down a long hallway to the door that led to the garage. He entered the garage, and he saw Jimmy's car was parked right there inside, facing the closed garage door. But other than that, there really wasn't much to see in the garage. There were no obvious prints, no sign of blood, no forced entry. So Valentine went back inside the house to keep looking. And a few minutes later, Valentine's fellow county detective, Alan Bean, stepped inside the home, and he was followed by several state forensics officers. Valentine and Bean worked together often, and so Valentine knew Bean had a sharp eye for evidence. And so Valentine right away told him that the front door and the door leading in from the garage had both been locked when police first arrived. And so Bean turned and went right to the front door, and he found that the door itself could be locked from the inside, but if someone had left through that door, they could only lock that door by using a key. Then Bean looked at the entryway of the house, and he saw there was a rug laying nearby, but it was at a strange angle, like somebody had pushed it away from the door. Then something between the rug and the door caught his eye. He crouched down and he signaled for Lieutenant Valentine to come look too. At first, Valentine thought what he was looking at was just some mud on the floor, but Bean pointed at one particular spot within the mud, and what it was a small portion of a shoe print. Now, there wasn't nearly enough of a print to tell what kind of shoe or what size it was, but Bean hoped the forensics team would be able to use this partial shoe print to tell them more at some point. Now, Bean and Valentine both knew that this print could just be the victim's, but there were no other prints anywhere like it on the floor, so it seemed like there was a real chance it belonged to the killer. As forensics officers began to pull the shoe print, Valentine led Bean over to the body. Multiple .40 caliber bullet casings lay on the floor near the dried pool of blood around Jimmy, and so it seemed clear Jimmy had been shot several times. And so Valentine and Bean came up with the same initial theory. Whoever killed Jimmy likely knew him really well. The level of violence inflicted on Jimmy looked like the result of rage that often accompanies a crime of passion. And assuming the killer was indeed close with Jimmy, they very likely had their own house key that they could have used to lock the door on their way out. The forensics team continued their work in the house, and the detectives canvassed the neighborhood to see if someone had seen or heard anything strange. And they found the information they were looking for at the very first house they tried. Jimmy's next-door neighbor told them that he had called the sheriff's department 2 nights earlier when he heard a series of loud popping sounds that maybe could have been gunfire or fireworks. He wasn't sure. Valentine asked if he knew what time that took place, and the man grabbed his phone, scrolled through his recent calls, and saw he had called the sheriff's department at 8:40 p.m. Now, even though Valentine and Bean did not have an official autopsy report from the medical examiner, at this point, they both felt confident that this neighbor had actually heard the sound of Jimmy's murder, and that Jimmy had very likely been laying dead in his house for 2 days. The detectives thanked the neighbor and then left and headed back over to Jimmy's house. There, a forensics officer waved them down and handed over Jimmy's phone that had been found inside of his pocket and bagged as evidence. And then, a little bit later that day, when Valentine and Bean were back at the station, they did a full data search of Jimmy's phone. And as they combed through Jimmy's text messages and calls, they knew exactly who they wanted to speak to first. The woman who had texted Jimmy right before he died, Carlotta Smith. The day after Jimmy's body was found, Detective Valentine walked Carlotta into an interview room at the sheriff's department. Valentine told her how sorry he was for her loss and how much he appreciated her coming in. Valentine wanted Carlotta to feel very at ease, as if she was just there to help. But in reality, she was already at the top of the investigator's suspect list. By this point, the medical examiner had officially confirmed Valentine and Bean's initial theory that Jimmy had died on the night that neighbor had called police, most likely not long after responding to Carlotta's text. Valentine and Bean had also contacted members of Jimmy's family, and they had learned that Carlotta and Jimmy had been in a serious relationship for about 6 months. And as Jimmy's serious girlfriend, she very likely had a key to his house, and she would also fit the profile of someone who would maybe commit a crime of passion. On top of that, a victim's intimate partners are almost always primary suspects at the beginning of any murder investigation. After Carlotta sat down at the table across from the two detectives, Valentine asked her about the final text message she had sent to Jimmy. Carlotta explained that she tried to text Jimmy every night when she knew he'd be getting home from basketball practice. It was one of the ways they stayed connected while living 3 hours apart. After that, Valentine asked Carlotta if she had her own key to Jimmy's house that she used whenever she came into town, but Carlotta shook her head and said no, she didn't. Valentine seemed very surprised. He said he thought that she and Jimmy were pretty serious and always stayed together when they visited each other. And Carlotta said they were serious, but she actually didn't stay at his house when they visited. She was a religious person, and she just didn't feel right spending the night at the house of a married man. So she had told Jimmy that until his divorce went through, she would stay by herself at a hotel whenever she came to town. Valentine hesitated for a second. He thought Carlotta actually sounded angry, and so he asked her if it bothered her that Jimmy was still married. And when he said this, Carlotta immediately seemed like she might just start crying. She said it absolutely bothered her, and she thought Jimmy was actually kind of dragging his feet with the divorce, and she was kind of tired of it. Valentine knew it was best to just let her keep talking, so he just kept nodding along like he understood exactly what she was going through. And so Carlotta just kept on talking. She went on a rant about Jimmy's wife and how he was still way too friendly with her and how it didn't make sense that this woman was still part of Jimmy's life. Finally, Carlotta trailed off, at which point Valentine asked her for a few more details about where she had been when Jimmy was killed. Carlotta said she had been at home in Nashville, but then she said police really needed to speak to Jimmy's wife. The wife and her son lived close to Jimmy, and the wife just could not seem to let Jimmy go. And Carlotta was sure Jimmy's wife still had a key. Valentine thanked Carlotta for coming in and told her she could leave. And then after she was gone, the detectives couldn't help but feel like Carlotta had not really helped her own cause here. If she was as angry about Jimmy's marriage as she seemed, then perhaps that was her motive to kill Jimmy. The following day, Valentine and Bean brought Jimmy's wife, Carla McLean, and her 19-year-old son, Dwayne Moore, into the station. Valentine and Bean questioned Carla first, and she seemed totally distraught about her husband's death. She said he was such a good man who loved God and loved helping young people. It just didn't make sense that he was gone. But Bean asked the obvious question. Was there any animosity between her and Jimmy during their 4-year separation and now during their initial divorce proceedings? But Carla just shook her head. She said that she and Jimmy were good friends, they just didn't quite work as a romantic couple. So Bean asked Carla if she still had a key to Jimmy's house, since after all, they were on good terms. Carla got a look on her face like she was searching for something, and then she said she didn't think she had a key, and if she did, she had forgotten where it was. Bean and Valentine nodded like that made complete sense, but inside, they did not buy that at all. And they believed Carla was lying right to their faces. Valentine asked Carla where she was on the night Jimmy was killed, and Carla said she'd been home the whole night with her son Dwayne, and he would vouch for her. Valentine nodded and then asked if police could actually have her phone to download her data, because this would be an easy way to confirm where she was and to cross her off their list. Carla immediately reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and put it on the table. She said police could search it all they wanted, she had absolutely nothing to hide. Bean picked up the phone and left the room, and then Carla was escorted out, and then her son, Dwayne, was brought in. Dwayne was quiet and respectful, but at first all he cared about was whether or not his mom was okay. And Valentine said his mom was just fine and she'd be waiting for them as soon as they were done. And so the detectives and Dwayne talked for a short time, and the kid seemed a bit nervous, but he was cooperative. He said he liked and respected Jimmy. They bumped heads sometimes like any stepfather and stepson would, but he thought, Jimmy was overall a good man, and he had no idea who would want to hurt him. Dwayne said he did not have a key to Jimmy's house, and that on the night Jimmy was killed, he was at home with his mom. Valentine thanked Dwayne for coming in, and then led him to an office where his mother was waiting. A little bit later, Bean informed Valentine that all the data on Carla's phone had been gathered up, and so the detectives gave Carla her phone back and told her and Dwayne they were free to go. It would take a while for Bean and other investigators to go through all of Carla's text messages and phone calls, and so while he waited, Valentine got back in touch with a few of Jimmy's family members, and they all said the same thing about Jimmy's wife, Carla. Her relationship with Jimmy was not nearly as good as she wanted people to believe. In fact, she and Jimmy had been fighting recently because Carla wanted him to sell his house and give her half of the profit as part of their divorce. After talking to Jimmy's family, Valentine delved a bit deeper into Carla and Jimmy's financial records, and he found a huge red flag. Carla was the beneficiary of Jimmy's life insurance policy. And so between that policy and the potential sale of the house, Carla stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars now that Jimmy was dead. So at this point, the detectives had two women, Jimmy's girlfriend and his wife, who were very strong suspects. Jimmy's girlfriend could have murdered him out of anger or jealousy about his marriage, and his wife could have killed him for the money. Over the next couple of days, investigators revisited the crime scene and conducted more interviews, trying to find anything that would directly connect Jimmy's girlfriend or wife to the murder. Then Detective Bean got a call from a forensics officer, and this officer sounded like he had just hit the jackpot. He told Bean they were able to create a reconstruction of the sole of the shoe that left that muddy footprint inside of Jimmy's house. And this shoe was a size 10.5 men's shoe, which was not the size shoe that Jimmy wore. Then the officer said that the forensics team had actually worked directly with Nike, and they were able to determine that the shoe was a Nike Air Force One high top, a favorite among young basketball players. Bean hung up and rushed over to tell Valentine the news, and they both felt exhilarated by it, but also totally confused. This was a huge piece of evidence, but it undercut the theory that one of the two women in Jimmy's life had killed him. Neither Carlotta nor Carla wore that size shoe. And so the detectives thought that this piece of evidence seemed to point to maybe somebody on the high school basketball team that Jimmy coached. Not long after learning about this shoe, Bean and Valentine headed to Memphis, Tennessee to interview students and faculty at the school where Jimmy taught and coached. And right away, things took a bizarre turn. A coach told the detectives that one of the team's star basketball players had recently been exposed as a 22-year-old man who was pretending to be a high schooler so he could dominate the sport and hopefully earn a college scholarship. The school had discovered the player's secret and promptly kicked him off the team after an anonymous call was made to the school district about this kid. Now, the coach said everybody knew Jimmy prided himself on being honest and that he despised the idea of cheating. And so a lot of people at the school thought Jimmy might have been the anonymous caller who sold out the 22-year-old. At this point, Valentine and Bean understood what the coach was getting at. If this 22-year-old player found out that, Jimmy was the guy who called on him, well, maybe he was the one who killed Jimmy for ruining his chances to play in college and maybe make it to the NBA. And to make things even more suspicious, the coach said the disgraced 22-year-old player had recently moved out of the city. The detectives thanked the coach and then tracked down the player's records in the school's front office. Valentine found a local phone number for the player's mother, so he reached out to the woman and asked her to come to the station. The following day, Valentine and Bean sat in the interview room, staring at a woman who either looked extremely young for her age or who had lied to them on the phone about who she was. So before Valentine launched into any questions about the investigation, he asked the woman flat out if she really was this player's mother. The woman just laughed and said no, she was his wife, and then she admitted that she had helped him forge his transcript and listed herself as his mother. This would allow him to go back and pretend to be a high schooler. Valentine and Bean looked at each other and just shook their heads. This all seemed absolutely absurd. Bean asked the woman if her husband had any issues with his coach, Jimmy McClain, or if he believed Jimmy was the one who called the school anonymously and exposed his scam. The woman kept on smiling. She said she didn't know if her husband had a problem with Jimmy, but Jimmy definitely did not call the district, because she did. Because she had caught her husband cheating on her with a high school girl, and she wanted to ruin him. Valentine looked over at Bean again, and then he just sat back in his chair and stared at this woman. This now seemed like something out of a soap opera. But still, even after this woman left, the detectives agreed that the fake high school basketball player was someone who might wear Nike Air Force One shoes. He also could have had problems with Jimmy about something else, and also his story was so strange and calculated and full of lies that Valentine and Bean did not want to rule him out, at least not yet. But just as they started looking deeper into this whole weird scenario with this fraudulent basketball player, something happened 300 miles away that would change the entire investigation. On the night of February 26, 2013, 6 days after Jimmy's murder, a woman in pajamas burst into a police station in Crossville, Tennessee, over 4.5 hours from Cordova, where Jimmy was killed. The woman screamed that she was in danger and she needed protection. Several officers got up from their chairs and ran over to her and ushered her into a small office. The police tried to calm her down, but she was frantic, and she kept looking all around her like somebody was following her. The officers told her they could help, but they needed to know what was going on. Finally, the woman took several breaths and calmed down, and then she said somebody had just told her husband who had murdered Jimmy McClain over in Cordova, and now she was worried that somebody would come after them because of what they knew. It took a while for the officers to get all the necessary information from this woman, but when they felt like they had a grasp on the situation, one of the officers rushed to his desk and called the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Lieutenant Valentine picked up, and he listened to the whole crazy story about this woman in pajamas. And information from that call led Valentine and Bean to do another search of Jimmy's wife's phone records. And during that search, they found what they were looking for. On the day of the murder, Jimmy's wife Carla had been texting with a young man in town who was a known drug dealer, a guy who everybody called Pooh. And Pooh definitely had the connections and the skills to have somebody killed. On March 5th, 2013, about 2 weeks after Jimmy's murder, 2 undercover cops sat in an unmarked car not far from Pooh's house. They were conducting surveillance on the house and waiting for Pooh to do something they could bring him in for. And they didn't have to wait long. The officers watched Pooh step out of his house, and he was clearly carrying a gun. And so the officers got out of their car and called out to Pooh, saying they needed to speak to him. But Pooh didn't waste any time. He ditched his gun into the yard and then took off running towards the back of his house. The 2 cops followed on foot, but Pooh sprinted through the alley, he ran between a couple of houses, and then he turned onto a residential street. Pooh looked over his shoulder, and the cops were nowhere to be seen, so he slowed down a bit and kept heading towards the end of the road. Suddenly, tires screeched on the road, and Pooh saw a SWAT vehicle come to a stop right in front of him. Pooh turned and tried to run again, but 2 members of the SWAT team leapt out of the vehicle, and they were fast. They caught up to Pooh and tackled him to the ground, and Pooh relented and did not put up a fight. The SWAT team would search him, and they would find baggies full of pills and also marijuana. And then a few minutes later, the undercover cops who had been conducting the surveillance, they arrived, and they had retrieved the gun that Pooh had thrown into the yard. And so now the police had enough evidence to hold Pooh on drug and weapons charges. A little bit later that day, Pooh sat inside of an interview room across from Detectives Valentine and Bean and several other investigators at the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Valentine stared across the table at Pooh and then glanced down at Pooh's phone that police had confiscated. Valentine held up the phone, leaned across the table, and showed Pooh a photo. Pooh looked at the photo and then lowered his eyes. The picture was of a handgun and piles of cash sitting on a blanket. Then Valentine pointed out several text messages that Pooh had sent and received from Jimmy's wife, Carla, leading up to the time of Jimmy's murder. Valentine said it did not take a huge leap to think maybe Pooh had been hired to kill Jimmy. Pooh was silent for a minute, then he raised his head and looked at Valentine and the other investigators, and he said he would tell them everything. Based on information provided by Pooh, cell phone data, evidence at the scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jimmy McClain on the night of February 20th, 2013. On that night, the killer slouched down in the driver's seat of their car that was parked just a few houses away from Jimmy's. In their hand, they clutched a Smith & Wesson Sigma, a .40 caliber pistol. A little after 8:30 p.m., the killer saw Jimmy's car pull up in front of his house and then reverse into his garage. The killer watched the garage door close all the way, hiding Jimmy inside the house, and at that point, the killer got out of their car, they crouched low to the ground, and ran across Jimmy's front yard, not noticing they had just gotten mud on the underside of one of their shoes. A moment later, the killer reached into their pocket and pulled out a single key on a key ring. They took a breath, clutched the gun tighter in their hand, and then crept out of the bushes. Staying low, they approached Jimmy's front door and quietly slipped that key into the lock. The killer raised the gun, unlocked the door, and threw it open, and as they did, the door slid a small rug out of the way, and the killer stepped right inside and then slammed the door behind them. And Jimmy was standing right there in the room, and when Jimmy turned around and saw a person in his house with a gun, he just started running, trying to get away. But the killer was ready, and they began shooting at Jimmy. Jimmy screamed out and fell to the floor right in front of the fireplace, and blood began pouring out of his shoulder and back, and the killer didn't even move. They stood right there firing over and over again, aiming at Jimmy's neck and head until the gun was empty. And after it was empty, the killer just stood there for a minute, staring at Jimmy's now lifeless body. Then they turned, calmly walked out of the front door, closed it, and locked it using that key. Then the killer crouched down, ran back across the lawn to their car, hopped inside, and sped all the way across town to their house. And once they were inside, they went right to their bedroom, hoping their mother had no idea they had even left. It would turn out the drug dealer Pooh provided Jimmy's killer with the murder weapon, but Pooh himself did not kill Jimmy. Jimmy's killer was his own 19-year-old stepson, Dwayne Moore, Carla's son. It would turn out Dwayne and Jimmy's relationship was far more volatile than Dwayne let on to police. Jimmy's adherence to his kind of obsessive routines and his belief that things should be done a very particular way had made it difficult for him to get along with his stepson, who he thought was kind of aimless and had no structure in his life. And so in an effort to combat this, Jimmy became a very strict stepfather to Dwayne, imposing all kinds of rules on the young man. And eventually, Jimmy kicked Dwayne out of the house when he caught Dwayne smoking weed. Dwayne had been on the investigators' radar from the beginning. As Jimmy's stepson, Dwayne made a logical suspect. But it was not until the woman in pajamas rushed into that police station with a wild story to tell that things began to fall into place. It turned out the woman in pajamas' husband was Dwayne's favorite uncle, and Dwayne had apparently spilled a whole bunch of information about Jimmy's murder to him, including Pooh's involvement. And so when Pooh was brought into custody, he admitted that he had gotten Dwayne a gun, but he said it was not the gun he'd photographed with the stacks of cash, and he said he had not killed Jimmy. Then Pooh told police that Dwayne often used his mother's cell phone, and so all those text messages they found to and from Pooh were actually with Dwayne, not Carla. Carla really had no idea what was going on. After Pooh spoke to investigators, they searched Dwayne and Carla's house, and they discovered that Dwayne had several pairs of basketball shoes that were size 10.5. He was definitely the one who had left that footprint at Jimmy's house. And soon after that, Dwayne would confess to the murder. But he said he didn't kill Jimmy just out of spite for how strict Jimmy had been. Instead, he said he had committed the murder because he believed Jimmy was mistreating his mother and trying to rip her off by not selling the house. Dwayne was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison without parole. He will be 43 years old when he is finally released. The University of Central Arkansas, Jimmy's alma mater, went on to create the Jimmy McLean Scholarship Fund to celebrate Jimmy's life in sports and to honor his dedication to mentoring student athletes. On the evening of January 3, 1991, a 40-year-old mountain climber named Yi Song felt the wind and snow whipping against his face as he stared up at a mountain peak jutting through the clouds high above him. Yi was standing more than 2/3 of the way up a mountain called Kawa, which is the highest mountain in the Meilan Snow Mountain Range in southwest China. Kawa stands at an elevation of about 22,000 feet, which is more than 4 miles, and nobody in recorded history had ever reached its peak. In fact, the Tibetan villagers who lived at the base of this mountain believed that nobody ever would, and some of those villagers regularly tried to prevent would-be climbers from even trying. But Yi and the 17-member team of climbers he was helping to lead were determined to prove the villagers wrong, and to make history. They had started climbing this mountain a month earlier, and they were now closer to the peak of Kawa than anyone had ever gotten. Yi turned his gaze away from the peak and looked around the temporary camp where he and his team were planning to spend the night. He could see several climbers struggling to reinforce their tents against the snow and the wind. He and his team had chosen to climb at this time of year because it was known as the dry season, when major storms were actually rare. So Yi couldn't understand why the snow just kept coming down. He grabbed his radio off his belt and called down to base camp, which was a camp at the foot of the mountain where other members of the team provided weather information and support to the climbers. Yi told a base camp team member that the snow was still unbelievably falling hard up here. That team member reminded him that the climbers should clear snow away from their tents at least every 2 hours. Yi was about to respond, but just then, his radio cut out, and he heard this loud buzzing sound coming from it. He stared down at his radio, confused. This was the sound it made when it needed a new battery, but he had just put a new battery in. Yi fumbled with the radio, trying to fix it, but all he could hear was this buzzing sound, and then also, periodically, he'd hear the voice of the base camp team member cutting in and out. Yi communicated over the radio and wasn't sure if anyone heard it, but he said he was losing communication and he would try to contact them again later. Then Yi turned off his radio, clipped it to his belt, and the buzzing stopped. As the sun finished setting, the wind picked up even more. Yi craned his neck upwards again, and he saw that the peak of Kawagabawa had now disappeared in the snow and the darkness. Yi had done lots of difficult climbs in the past, and he was sort of used to running into problems right when he thought he was about to achieve his goals. That was just how mountains worked. All the planning in the world could not prepare climbers for everything. But for some reason, this felt different. This storm just didn't show any signs that it would ever let up. Yi lowered his head and walked towards a group of tents. He wanted to help his team clear snow away. But all of a sudden, Yi heard screaming coming from inside one of these tents. He and several other climbers moved as quickly as they could through the snow toward the sound. They stepped into the tent, and they saw a woman laying in her sleeping bag, and she was shivering uncontrollably, and sweat was running down her forehead. Yi knew this woman, who was one of several Japanese climbers on their team, had been dealing with a high fever for days. But now, she didn't just look sick, she looked terrified. As soon as Yi entered the tent, the woman stopped screaming, and she just started muttering. Yi knew some Japanese, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He looked around the tent, and he could tell that the other Japanese climbers who had come in were also confused by the woman's words. Yi turned to one of them and asked, what is she saying? And in a little more than a whisper, the climber told Yi the woman was saying, "Something is coming." Later that night, the storm began to reach blizzard conditions as Yi made his way around the camp, checking on his team. As bad as the weather had gotten, and as alarming as the screaming Japanese woman had been, Yi refused to panic. He believed if everyone just stayed calm and prepared, they could make it through the night. But he quickly realized he was the only one who felt this way. Each climber Yi spoke to seemed as frightened as the woman with the fever. He tried his best to calm everyone down he spoke to, but nothing he did seemed to work. So eventually, he headed back towards his own tent to make sure it was secure. But before he got there, he heard more shouting. At first, Yi assumed it was the woman with the fever, but he listened more closely and he could tell it couldn't be, because it was a man's voice. Yi trudged back through the snow towards this shouting man's tent to see what was wrong, and when he stepped inside, Yi felt truly scared for the first time since he'd come to the mountain. Inside the tent, Yi saw one of the climbers sitting by a fire, pen and notebook clutched in his hands, and on his face was this wild look. His eyes were darting from one side of the tent to the other, and he would shout at something only he could see and hear. And then he would scribble furiously in his notebook. It was like he had lost his mind. Yi was so unsettled that he just backed out of the tent, and as soon as he was outside, he turned and began rushing back through the snow towards his tent. However, as he was between tents, he heard this loud rumbling sound, almost like the banging of a drum, coming from high up the mountain. He froze where he was, terrified, and he heard the sound of trees cracking and splitting, and he knew this must be it. This is the avalanche. However, when Yi looked up the mountain, expecting to see a mass of ice and rock barreling down the mountain towards them, all he could see was the falling snow and the black night sky. There was no avalanche. Early the next morning, January 4th, the snowstorm subsided, and the weather on Kawagabawa turned calm and sunny. A team leader down at base camp radioed up to Yi to see how the climbers fared over the night, but Yi didn't respond. So the team leader tried radioing the other members of the team that were up there with Yi as well, but they too didn't respond. And so this team leader sent out a small search team to see if they could get a visual of Yi and the other climbers he was with. However, remember, these climbers were thousands of feet up the mountain from base camp. So under the best of circumstances, it would have been really hard to look up and have seen them. And these were certainly not the best circumstances. there had been this huge snowstorm over the night, a snowstorm that really wasn't even supposed to happen this time of the year, which made getting a visual on Zhiyi and his team nearly impossible. And so this team leader quickly realized that if the climbers had gotten lost up on the mountain, he didn't have the resources to mount an effective search. So he quickly informed multiple government agencies that his team was missing, and then the government took over. That day, the Chinese government launched a massive operation on Kawagabawa. Professional search and rescue teams worked with volunteers on the ground, and airplane and helicopter pilots circled the mountain. But after 2 weeks of this daily intense searching, it became clear Zhiyi and the rest of the climbers, along with any remnants of their camp, had disappeared. On January 22nd, so 18 days after the climbers had gone missing, rescuers abandoned the search, and the government issued an official statement. The statement said that while massive snowstorms were indeed rare for this time of the year, they were not actually impossible to occur. So officials said the storm likely caused an avalanche that wiped out the camp and buried the climbers somewhere they couldn't be found. Now, this explanation was very logical, and for most people, it marked the end of this very tragic story. But not for the villagers who lived at the base of Kawagabawa. These villagers, who didn't think anyone would ever summit the mountain, and who actively tried to stop those that did, they did not believe the official statement. They had a story of their own, which they were certain was the real explanation for what had happened to the climbers. And when the government issued its statement, these villagers tried to tell people that the government was wrong. And so, when climbers and tourists from all over came to Kawagabawa, these villagers told them what they believed actually happened, and how it would happen all over again if anyone tried to reach the mountain's peak. Now, most people dismissed the villagers' story as rumor or superstition, and that was a reasonable way to react to this, until 7 years later, when 3 shepherds from the village made a terrible discovery. Seven years later, on the afternoon of June 18, 1998, 3 shepherds were walking along a glacier near the base of Kawagabawa. This glacier was 2.5 miles away from where Zhiyi and the rest of his climbers had set up their final camp. But the shepherds were not there to do any kind of search. This glacier was located near their village, and it was home to a temple that they often visited. So they were talking and walking towards the temple when, just up ahead of them, one of the shepherds spotted something bright and colorful sticking up out of the ice. The group was intrigued, and they began walking towards it, thinking it might be a prayer flag. But as they got closer, and this colorful object came into focus, the group went quiet. And then the shepherds also saw there were other colored objects just like this one scattered around the area. These objects were the bodies of the climbers who had disappeared from Kawagabawa 7 years earlier, still wrapped in the colorful coats they'd been wearing when they headed up the mountain. But what the shepherds could not have known in this moment was that buried under the ice with the bodies was a diary, which one of the climbers had used to record the events of the ascent. It belonged to the climber that Zhiyi had seen shouting at an unseen force and scribbling furiously on the night they all vanished. And this diary would reveal that the stories the villagers told about Kawagabawa and the lost climbers were more than just legend. It would turn out there was a very specific reason why these Tibetan villagers believed nobody would ever reach the peak of Kawagabawa. It was because the peak was said to be a sacred place. It was the home of a warrior protector god, and because of this, it was not meant for human beings to climb. The villagers believed that if anyone ever approached the peak, it would wake the spirits of the mountain, and the mountain god would punish them. This punishment would lead to death, but it would not stop there, because the dead would become prisoners of the mountain for 7 years. And these villagers had made their beliefs very clear to Zhiyi and the rest of his team of climbers who wanted to be the first people to ever reach Kawagabawa's peak. In fact, a group of villagers had heavily protested their climb and warned the climbers that their expedition would anger the mountain god and result in tragedy. But Zhiyi and the rest of his climbers had not heeded their warnings. the diary of the climber that was discovered along with the bodies recounted what happened as a result. The diary started like a lot of climbing diaries do, an account of the day's hike, the scenery, the weather. But as the dates got closer to the night the climbers disappeared, the diary took a strange turn. The writer became obsessed with these shadows he saw walking across his tent, and he said he heard women laughing and babies crying all around him in the darkness. That woman who had screamed out, who was sick with a fever, had said she felt something bad was coming, and she had tried to warn the others. But by the time Juryi heard the sound like beating drums high up on the mountain that he thought was an avalanche, like many thought was an avalanche, the mountain god had apparently already unleashed his wrath. As soon as Juryi and those climbers had disappeared, the villagers all assumed that they had faced the wrath of the mountain god. But the fact that their bodies had remained hidden for 7 years, the length of time the mountain god keeps the dead imprisoned in the mountain, was all the proof the villagers needed to know they were right. And the climber who wrote the diary ended up believing them too, although it was too late. In his final diary entry, he wrote, quote, "We were wrong. They are coming. Run." In 2001, 10 years after the climbers had died on the mountain, the Chinese government banned all mountain climbing activities in the Meilin snow mountain range. To this day, still, nobody on record has ever actually set foot on the peak of Kawagabawa. Our next story is called Something in the Bushes. On a June day in 1953, a 31-year-old American doctor named George Moore stood in a small mountain campsite in Nepal, staring out at a massive rainstorm forming on the horizon. George had been in Nepal, which is a country south of China, for 8 months, leading a small medical team trying to stop the spread of diseases like malaria in villages all across the region. This was groundbreaking work in 1953, and it was starting to make George famous back home in America. And here in Nepal, he had already become a trusted figure among the villagers, many of whom had never seen a person from the West until they met George. But right now, a group of these villagers were scrambling to get George out of their village. And this was because of the storm that George was looking at. One of the villagers pointed at the clouds and told George this was not a regular thunderstorm. The monsoons were coming. And once the monsoons hit, the only dirt road that led back to George's base in the city of Kathmandu would flood very quickly. And the horrendous rains could last for months, which meant if George wanted to continue his work stopping disease in other parts of this region, he would have to get out right now. George had known the monsoon season was coming, but it had arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, and so he and his team were sort of caught off guard. The journey out of the village was not something they wanted to undertake suddenly with so little preparation, because they didn't have a car. They literally had to walk out, and so they needed to be fully prepared. And also, this dirt road out of the village went through a deep forest where the locals claimed it was inhabited by terrible monsters. Now, while George did not believe in the supernatural, he did think that, fantastical stories about monsters often started because of real-life animal attacks. And so, monsters or not, the forest was definitely dangerous, especially since they again would be on foot. But George knew they really didn't have any other choice. They did have to go right now. George quickly gathered up first aid kits, medicine, and supplies and put them into a large pack. Then he reached down, pulled a revolver out of the holster on his hip, and spun the chamber to make sure the gun was fully loaded. And when he saw all 6 bullets, he knew he was as ready as he was going to be. George holstered his gun, thanked the villagers for their help, and then turned to lead his team out. But as he stepped onto the road, one of the villagers grabbed his arm to stop him. Then they pointed towards a spot on the mountain above the road that George and his team needed to take, and George looked up and saw large billows of smoke rising above the trees and into the sky. In a strained voice, the villager told him that no matter what, George and his team must not go anywhere near where that smoke was. The storm continued to move in as George and his team began their journey. The men were getting wet and muddy, and the thunder was so loud it made their bodies feel like they were vibrating. But the rain really was not their biggest problem. Because by the time they had gotten maybe a mile or so from the village, a thick fog had rolled in and covered the entire road. And then suddenly, it was like the fog got so intense that George couldn't even see his team anymore. George did his best to try to walk as straight as he could, doing his best to stay on the road, but the fog at this point was so intense, he couldn't even see the ground, so he didn't even know if he was on the road. And then in the back of his head, he couldn't help but have this fear that because he didn't know where he was going and couldn't see his team, that he would unwittingly walk over to the place where that smoke was coming from. But he reassured himself that that couldn't possibly happen because the smoke looked really far away when they had set out, and this fog had only really rolled in for the last couple of minutes, so there's no way he could have gone all the way over there. But as George stumbled along, bumping into trees and feeling totally disoriented, the fog only seemed to grow thicker. The sound of the wind and the rain swirled around him, and George started to feel really disoriented, like he was in a dream or something. Then this horrific shriek cut through the pounding of the rain and the howling of the wind. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a wild animal, although George had no idea what kind it was. But George didn't need to know what this animal was to know it was a threat, and he needed to get away from it fast. So he turned and just began hustling in the direction away from the sound. But again, he could barely see. He was bumping into trees, he was stumbling on rocks. At this point, he knew he was well off the dirt road, but had no way of getting back to it. He didn't know where his team was, he called out to them, but didn't hear back. I mean, he's totally panicking at this point. And after a few minutes of trekking away from that shrieking sound, suddenly something huge and dark loomed up in front of George. For a second, he flinched, like somehow that shrieking animal had paced around him and now was stopping his way. But then he realized what he was seeing was actually this huge boulder. Frantically, he began climbing the boulder, thinking if he got to higher ground, he'd be safe from whatever was shrieking behind him. And as George climbed, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a member of his team. It was an entomologist. And amazingly, he was right behind George, standing at the base of the boulder. George just hadn't seen or heard him. The entomologist also seemed panicked and began climbing as well, and while he did, he shouted to George that he just heard movement coming from the plants. And so whatever animal was out here that this entomologist had also heard was clearly close by. George and the entomologist made it to the top of the boulder. They stood there, shivering and muddy, still surrounded by fog. George could feel his heart pounding, but he tried to hold his breath and not make a sound. The two men listened, trying desperately to hear any sign of this creature that had shrieked. But there was no more sound. It was silent. But seconds later, the men heard a new sound. It was like something was moving quickly through nearby bushes down below the boulder. George and the entomologist crouched down, trying desperately to see what was down there. And as they did, they saw the shadow run through the fog. On instinct, George put his hand on the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw, and now neither of the men moved a muscle. Then another noise came from the fog. George thought it sounded like grunts and teeth chattering. For a second, everything fell silent again. Then George heard heavy footsteps nearby. He started to shake with fear, but at the same time, he was desperate to see what was coming. So he leaned forward over the boulder as much as he could, trying to look down to see what this thing was. And suddenly, through the fog, he saw a pair of bright yellow eyes staring right back up at him. George tried to get back up, but it was like he was frozen. He just crouched there staring at the eyes in the fog. And slowly, he saw more pairs of yellow eyes appear in the fog. And he saw shadows of what looked like long tails whipping back and forth. Instantly, George thought of the monsters from the villagers' stories. But he told himself that's ridiculous. These were clearly just langur monkeys. He reminded himself that he was a doctor, a scientist. There had to be a rational explanation. These were just animals. They couldn't be monsters. But then one of these creatures moved forward and put its claw on the boulder and began to climb up. And at this point, George finally got a clear look at it. He saw this thing stood at least 5 feet tall, much bigger than any of the langur monkeys or any other monkeys that inhabited this forest. And instead of fur, It had gray skin, but most terrifying was its mouth, which was unnaturally large, stretching almost from ear to ear, and it was filled with these sharp teeth, the same color as its eyes. And as this creature slowly began to ascend the boulder, George felt a level of fear he had never experienced, something primitive from deep down inside of him. A single terrifying thought blared in his mind. These creatures are not of the natural world. These creatures are godly. Now George screamed and drew his gun. He was too afraid to aim it at the creatures directly, so he pointed it up into the air and began shooting. The creatures let out a chorus of these horrible shrieks, the same shrieks they had heard earlier. Then he watched as the creatures turned and their shadows and their yellow eyes disappeared back into the fog. George and the entomologist stayed huddled on top of that boulder, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. Those creatures did not come back, and eventually, the rest of George's team found him and the entomologist. The two men scrambled down from the boulder, and they joined the group. The team asked them what happened. They said that, George and the entomologist had gotten too far ahead of them in the fog, and they'd lost them. Then they heard the gunshots. But all George could say was, "We have to get out of here right now. I will explain later." And as the team set off again, George took a second and turned back around and looked in the direction of the boulder, where he and the entomologist had seen these creatures. And now that he had a little more perspective and the fog had cleared just a little bit, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. That column of smoke that he had been warned not to go anywhere near was coming up right from behind the boulder. He and the entomologist accidentally fled to the exact spot they were told not to go. That night, after a long hike, George and his team finally made it to their base. And it was only when he was back in the safety of his camp, with friendly villagers all around him, that George was able to finally think clearly again about what he had just experienced, with the strange creatures in that place where the smoke was. He didn't know what to make of it. George was a United States Army veteran and a man of science. He didn't believe in monsters or terrible gods roaming the forests. But he told his story as accurately as he could to the villagers, hoping they would have some realistic explanation for what the creatures were. But what the villagers had to say only left George feeling even more unsettled. So George decided he was just not going to speak of what he had seen to anyone anymore. He had a bright future ahead of him as a doctor. He wasn't going to throw it away by making himself look crazy. And so when he got to America, and people asked him about his time in Nepal, he would tell them a wild story about this chance run-in with a group of langur monkeys. But the true memory of the creatures he actually saw out there, which were not langur monkeys, at least not to him, never left George. Their height, their yellow eyes, their huge mouths and sharp teeth, and the pure fear George had felt in their presence. George was a man of science, which made him want to forget this encounter. But he was also a man of truth, and so after spending years with these memories in his head, George came to believe that he had a duty to tell the truth about what he actually saw, no matter what the consequences were. And so in 1957, 4 years after his encounter in Nepal, Dr. George Moore published a first-hand account of what he had seen in a magazine article that was titled, "I Met the Abominable Snowman." In this article, he explained that the place on the mountain where the smoke was rising, where the villagers warned George not to enter, was called the House of the Gods. And the House of the Gods was home to the Yeti. A Yeti is an ape-like creature said to live in the Himalayas, and is similar to Bigfoot, but thought to be a bit shorter. In the West, the Yeti is often referred to as the Abominable Snowman. And in his article, George said he'd come face to face with a pack of them in Nepal. Telling the world what he'd seen did not adversely affect George like he'd feared. He went on to have a long, successful career and is still considered a pioneer in the field of medical outreach. And because of George's standing as a doctor and researcher, his encounter in Nepal has remained one of the most highly credible cryptid sightings in modern history. And so, as much as some explorers and scientists might think we can fully understand the natural world, both of these stories are proof that you can't. On the morning of December 21st, 1980, a woman in her 40s walked into a jail cell in Los Angeles, California. Now, in this jail cell already was another inmate. Her name was Etta Louise Smith. She was 32 years old, and at the time, she was laying on one of the benches inside of this cell. Etta had actually been in jail for 4 days leading up to this moment. The police were sure Etta had something to do with the savage murder of a nurse in the area, but they really didn't understand what role she had played. In fact, virtually everything about Etta was very confusing to police. And Etta herself was not really doing herself any favors because she wasn't really explaining how she had the information that she had. Now, Etta had already gone through a 10-hour-long interrogation, which led police nowhere. She had undergone a polygraph test, which didn't lead to any new answers. And she had also undergone a thorough strip search. She had been kept without food for 24 hours at one point. She had been left in this cold jail cell without shoes for 4 days. But she just wouldn't crack. She would not confess to playing a role in this murder. And so this was why police on this day had decided to go another route to get information out of Etta. That woman in her 40s who had just walked into Etta's jail cell was pretending to be an inmate, but in reality, she was an undercover cop. And her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Etta, win her trust, and see if maybe then Etta would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Etta. And at this point, Etta was woken up by the noise and she sat up on her bench and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop, she was immediately struck by Etta's appearance. Etta did not look like a murderer. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Etta was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She is effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it, and she's just laying down sleeping in her cell making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down, and at some point she asked Etta, hey, what are you in here for? And Etta, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second. And then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never going to believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Etta would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character. Because Etta, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's hearing this, but in her mind, she's like, okay, well, I clearly just discovered Etta's motive for being involved in this murder. Etta wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Etta and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Etta talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust. Because Etta had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now here Etta was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Etta, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Etta played a role in her murder. His theory went like this. 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police were called and a search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Etta just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so the detective who was talking to Etta at the time when she came in and said this, he brought out a map and he said, okay, point to where she is. And Etta had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Etta, how do you know this? Etta would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, Etta, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me you know where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me? And Etta would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Etta when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Etta because she looked so unthreatening, and what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Etta was, he discovered that she had a great job, she worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Etta would have this information, the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Etta was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Etta, hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter, we'll fly out over that canyon, and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together. And so Etta said, okay, sounds good. She turned and she left. But then just an hour later, Etta came back into the police station with her 2 young kids in the car, and she would tell that detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, 1, had gone out by herself to do this, but 2, had brought along her kids as well? Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Etta's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon, and sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Etta said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Etta and said, you're under arrest, I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved. The captain thought by putting Etta in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Etta had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story that was kind of still developing would likely be turned into a movie. And so the captain really didn't know what to do because at this point, Etta had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police. And there was no evidence that actually tied Etta to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Etta came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that 4th day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Etta would go into the police station to report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was, well, on that day, Etta was at work listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Etta listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really was no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Etta's listening to the news about Melanie that Etta heard a voice in the room she was in. And the voice said very clearly to Etta, she's not in one of those houses. And Etta immediately, when she heard it, she turned around wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her, but there was nobody else in the room. And then it was like immediately there were these flashes of images in Etta's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road and then a bush and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Etta very clearly saw these three images. And it was right then that Etta thought, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car and she drove to the police station and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Etta just couldn't wait. And so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind. And sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen. Then she found the bush that she had seen. And then with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe. And it was right near Melanie's body. Which meant that voice that Etta heard and the vision she had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the fourth day that Etta was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop, the phone call that changed the whole case, well, the phone call was from another police officer saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed and they were now being held in jail. And so clearly, Etta did not commit this murder, and so even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Etta the same day, so she was released, and then ultimately the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty, and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta would sue the police department, and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Etta really did have a psychic vision that led to the discovery of Melanie's body. Etta would never go on to make a movie about her story, and in fact, when she was asked later on about why she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Etta would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm living out a bad movie. And so that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened. Our next story is called The Burning Question. On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked, and then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door, and right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted, and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor, and it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground. And she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luz jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luce charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there, and so without any hesitation, Luce charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room, thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luce is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luce out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside. And just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luce, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that, unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luce's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luce also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luce is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luce began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luce became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luce was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and, Luce basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luce has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luce walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded-up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. So he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luce dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luce and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luce had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luce came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby. And that person was one of Luce's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Delamar Vera. It was Luce's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luce was at that family party, Well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luce knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out like, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luce had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing, because when Luce went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter, but investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luce was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. The next and final story of today's episode is called Who Said That? At 12:30 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road, they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged. And he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV. And so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here, there's a baby in here." And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped the straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes, at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman, and he's going to take this baby to safety, because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics, and right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing, but he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Gorsbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know, but we know at 10:30 she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there. And when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard and they do not have an explanation for it. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen's podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool,